Okay, this video is a review of the AP argument essay. By the end of this video, you should understand what the AP argument essay is and basically what it looks like and what you're expected to do bare minimum on that essay. Let's get started. So the first thing that you should know about the argument essay is that it is actually pretty similar to the AP synthesis essay. The synthesis essay, if you remember, looked something like this, except without the big X's through it, okay? But the first thing that you would remember from the synthesis essay is that there was a prompt page. And if you recall on that synthesis essay prompt page, basically that prompt presented you with something that you could argue for or against, right? It presented you with something that was debatable, where you could take maybe different positions were possible to take. And then after that, it gave you different sources to draw from. And you would use various quotations from these different sources, like source A here. You would use various quotations from these different sources to back yourself up as evidence. That's the synthesis essay. Well, the argument essay is similar in that it asks you to take a stance or take a position and make an argument and support it with evidence, but they don't give you any of these sources like the synthesis essay does. So you may be wondering, if I don't have these sources, how do I support my argument? What counts as evidence on this kind of essay? Well, there's a certain degree to where a lot of what you use as evidence for the argument essay has depends on just whether or not you know a lot about the topic, whether you're lucky or not that you get a topic that you're familiar with. If you happen to be familiar with the topic that you're arguing, then you can use examples of things that you've read about or that you know about already. Examples from history. All of those things work in an argument essay, so it helps if you know a lot about history or a lot about current events because that provides you with a lot of evidence for your argument. But let's just assume that you don't have any knowledge about the topic really in history or in current events. Let's assume you just had really bad luck and you got a prompt that you just really don't know a lot about altogether. Well, you still have to have evidence to support your argument, but that evidence now can come from your ideas. Basically, that evidence can be personal experiences you've had, and it can be observations, so things you've observed other people or things go through. So when all else fails, you can use personal experience and observations as evidence. There are two keys to having success on the AP argument essay, and one key is that you make a really good plan before you start writing, that you actually outline where you're going with your argument, the types of evidence you're going to use, and those kind of things. And the other really important thing is that you read the prompt carefully and you understand exactly what it is they're asking you to do in your essay. And the reason this is so important is because the prompt pages can sometimes be confusing. You'll notice that the AP argument essay prompt page doesn't have as much on it as some of the other AP style essays, but let's take a look at this together. It's important to read all of what's on the prompt page. They usually give you some information at the beginning here, like this, and that information is there to get you thinking in the direction they want you to think. That's not actually the task they're giving you, but it's just giving you some ideas to pull from. You can't settle with just reading part of it. You need to read all of it, because usually the actual prompt doesn't appear until towards the end of the page. This is an example of an argument essay prompt from the 2008 AP English Language and Composition exam. Take a look at it, go ahead and pause it, read through it, and see what kinds of things they're asking you to do in an argument essay. Go ahead and pause the video. Okay, hopefully you noticed that it just gave you some ideas with this first paragraph, and then we don't really get to the actual prompt until down here, right? They say using appropriate evidence, write an essay in which you evaluate the pros and cons of corporate sponsorships for schools and indicate why you find one position more persuasive than the other. That's an example. Okay. If you'll notice, they also tell you what are the two basic sides of this argument. You see right here, this one and this one. If you receive this prompt, you would have to take a position on whether corporate sponsorships, partnerships for schools were kind of a positive thing or a negative thing. You'd have to say which side is more convincing, and you'd have to provide evidence from your experience, from things you've read about or seen, to back up your claim. You never know what exactly the AP argument essay prompt is going to be about. It could be about sports and schools and corporations, or it could be similar to the 2009 AP English Language and Composition argument essay prompt that we see right here. Take a second to look at this one. Notice how it's different from the last prompt that we saw, and think about how you would argue this one. Go ahead and pause the video now. So this AP argument essay prompt is clearly very different. In this one, they offer you a quotation. It's kind of difficult quotation. And then down here, they kind of tell you what your task is, okay? And it says, consider this quotation about adversity from the Roman poet Horace. And then it tells you your choices for stances you can take. You can defend the quotation. That means that you agree with what Horace had to say about adversity and you want to back him up with your own evidence and experiences. You can challenge the quotation. That means you can disagree with Horace, you can disagree with what he said, and you would have to provide experience and observations that would prove why he was wrong. Or it says that you can qualify what Horace said about adversity, and this means that you would say, yes, I agree, but I usually don't recommend that you try to qualify it unless you're very, very comfortable with the topic, because this requires quite a bit more skill in your writing. So I would say it's usually better to either defend the statement or challenge the statement. But with a prompt like this, you would take a position on whether you agree with that quotation or not, and then you would have to identify some evidence. You would have to talk about some experiences you had that maybe showed what adversity came up with, or things you've observed, or things you've read about in other places, and all of those kinds of things would count as evidence. As we've said, you never know what topic these argument essay prompts are going to bring. And to a certain degree, you're either kind of lucky and you get something that you're familiar with, or you're unlucky and it's going to be a little bit more difficult for you, okay? You have to rely more on your personal experience and observation. For instance, in 2010, the following year, the AP argument essay asked you to defend, challenge, or qualify de Botton's statement, a statement about humor and comedians in our society, and basically asks you to either say that humorists and comedians play an important role in our society or a destructive role. If you happen to be like me and you're a really big fan of comedians and comedy and the role they play in our society with kind of criticizing things and showing some of our faults, then you would be able to give a lot of examples from comedy you've heard and comedians, different acts that you know of, and that would work as evidence. If not, you might have to draw more from your personal experience, okay? Things you've observed, things you've heard, and that kind of thing. Once again, it's kind of the luck of the draw on the topic. Again, check out this 2011 AP argument essay prompt. This one is a little bit different again. In this one, they ask you to read this excerpt from a piece of writing by Thomas Paine in 1791, and then to examine the extent to which this is true about America today. All right, you would have to use personal experience and observation if you didn't know historical examples to use. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some student samples and see what it looks like to answer this prompt. So go ahead and pause this prompt and go ahead and read through it so that you can see what the prompt is, and then we'll look at some student samples and see how they did. Okay, so before we get into this, let's talk about planning your argument essay. When you look at an argument prompt, before you start writing, you need to go through some quick steps. The first step would be you need to pick a side. You need to determine what argument it is now that you're going to make. You have to be clear. You've got to pick a side. You don't want to be wishy-washy. You clearly need to take a position. Remember, this test is on how you write and persuade, not on your ideas necessarily. The next step would be to actually think out and plan what reasons you might give in your thesis statement, right? Because remember, those reasons are what you're going to try to create the most convincing evidence to prove. If you provide evidence for each of your reasons, then you have proven your point, okay? The next aspect of your planning that you want to do before you write is you want to construct your thesis statement. Right? Remember, we have a lesson available to you on writing a thesis statement. You need to go back and look on that if you're confused or need help, because that's an important piece to writing this essay well. Then, lastly, in your plan before you start writing, you should actually plan out your evidence. This is the key. Your evidence will mostly be experiences you've had or things you've observed. Good evidence will make for a stronger argument. Here's what I tend to see. The students that actually make a plan before they begin writing do very well in this essay. They provide plenty of evidence to back up their argument. What I see a lot though is that students maybe only write a thesis statement for their plan, or they kind of decide that they're going to plan while they write, and that never works out well. What usually happens is a student writes a great intro, a great thesis statement, and one good chunk of evidence, but that's just not enough. That's where they stop because our brains aren't good at switching between planning mode and writing mode. So it's really important that you plan first and then you start writing. It's the number one thing I see students make mistakes on the argument essay. Okay, this student essay actually scored a 9 out of 9, the highest score you can get on an AP essay. And if you want to take a second and pause it and read through the essay, that's fine. I'll tell you the gist of what this student did. This student happened to be very familiar with history enough that he didn't have to rely a lot on personal experience or observations, and instead talked about things that he knew about in history and used those things as evidence. That is the ideal situation. If you're lucky enough that you happen to know something that works as evidence for that prompt that you've studied on your own, absolutely use it, explain it, do what you need to do. That will get you those upper echelon of scores. But the reality is, we don't know what we're going to get on that topic. So we want to prepare for the worst and assume that, man, we just don't know a lot about the topic. So a good example of student writing that does that well is this piece right here. This student relies more on their personal experience. They scored a 6 out of 9, which remember, if we can average a score of 5 on each of these essays and get half the multiple choice right, we're in shape to pass that AP test. So if this student got a 6, they're in a good place. And they maybe didn't have as many historical examples and things like that, but that's okay because they recovered by using personal experience. That's the method I'm showing you today. Take a minute to read through this student's first paragraph. Pause the video and read through it. This student does a great job of restating information from the prompt in their introduction. And then you'll notice they close out their first paragraph with a very good thesis statement. 220 years later, Paine's belief still holds true even though there are greater distinctions in America. Very clearly, this student has taken a position. Great thesis statement. Now, this is what I really want you to see, their first chunk of evidence. And if you'll notice, the evidence they use is personal experience. Go ahead and read through this section and pause it and read through it and see what you think. And I'll move this to the next page for you so you can finish reading that initial paragraph. Go ahead and pause it and read the rest. Okay, let's go back here. So, in this first evidence chunk, you'll notice that they did a great job of just talking about their own experience. They're from New York City, they're from Brooklyn. They talked about that. You'll notice that they even say, on a personal level, I live in a mixed part of Brooklyn. And the evidence is their actual experience, right? With all these different people that they know and all the different religions, and that there are rare situations in which who or where we come from plays a factor, right? That's a great job of using personal experience as evidence, and that's what I'm asking you to do. So what this student did is that they looked through that and they used that as evidence as well as some other things, and they just continue to repeat that process till they had built up enough evidence, enough examples to have proved their point. That's what you're trying to do with this personal experience and observation. So that's what we're going to look at finally here at the end. I want to give you an idea of the basic structure of what you can do in this essay. Remember, this is not the only way you can do it. There's a lot of different ways to do it. But if you're really struggling with, okay, I don't really know how this should be organized and how I should do it, this is one way that your essay can look. You can always start that essay with an opening paragraph that includes an introduction to hook your reader's interest, right? Maybe shoot for about 3 to 5 sentences there, and conclude that opening paragraph with a thesis statement, 1 to 2 sentences. Then you would continue with your chunks of body, right? They don't necessarily have to be 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs. It just depends on how you want to organize it. But for each reason you gave in your thesis statement, you can have a body chunk where you introduce your reason, you give your evidence, you tell the little experience or story that you have that's going to be your evidence. And then this is the part a lot of students neglect to do because students assume that it just makes sense to the audience, but you need to also explain and connect that personal experience or observation you gave to the thesis statement. How does it all connect? What did you want them to get out of that? If you do that chunk for each reason, you will have a pretty well argued essay. Okay, and then you can have a conclusion and hit your point home, and you've done your job with this essay. Um, there are other videos that can help you with the argument essay where we talk about evidence and how to write it and how to create it. If you have any questions, make sure to come talk to me about it and we can clear up any confusion you have. I hope this lesson on the AP argument essay was helpful, and good luck.